going to start with a quote from the Rig Veda. Ano Badrak Gatavo Yantu Vishwata. Well, the reason I quoted that is to establish my patriotism beyond doubt. My colleague quoted from the Buddha, who was a rebel against Hinduism. So my credentials are really strong. Well, actually the sloka is not all that irrelevant to this morning's session. It translates as, let good ideas come to us from everywhere. And there can be no better motto for a university, for higher education in general. It probably has been adopted as a motto by some one of our universities, but in practice, nothing of that kind ever really happens in our institutions of higher education, by and large. One of the things that concerns everybody, and concern has been expressed here, is that fact that many of these institutions are not allowed to function with any autonomy. There is interference of different kinds from the powers that be. The latest and most striking example has been what is happening at JNU and at the Central University at Hyderabad. But there have been numerous other instances of interference in the autonomy, which of course did not attract the same kind of attention, the spectacular attention that the JNU events attracted, nor was there much debate in the media on issues related to them. Because in some sense, one would rather not have these debates on these issues on Times Now and such channels, but that's a different story. We all know, many of us certainly know, that what happened to one of the directors of IITs, the director of IIT Delhi was shunted away without any consideration. He was considered an outstanding man by the IIT community, and they couldn't fault him on any of his actions, but nevertheless, he was sacked. He was asked to go. And again, Dr. Kakorkar, who's well-known and eminent technologist, who was heading a committee for selection of directors for IITs, was also treated rather poorly, rather badly. And then there was this story about the Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, who introduced the so-called 4-year program, undergraduate program. Personally, I was totally against it. I did not think it was a sensible thing, but the manner in which he was made to withdraw that wasn't particularly correct. It was an interference which is uncalled for. It should have been settled within the university, which is not how it was done. Well, these are some of the examples where there is interference. So, the autonomy is certainly under threat. Of course, there is always the argument that many of these higher education institutions have not delivered on what they are supposed to. But that's a different story. It's not as if this interference is going to enable them to deliver. And now, as was pointed out, there are other ways in which institutions are affected, namely financial. The money being given to institutions is being cut without any reason or rhyme. Accountability, of course, has to be there. It's a legitimate demand made on public funded institutions. If they're not delivered, starving them of funds would be legitimate, but what is happening is something across the board. No matter what, you cut the funds. And this idea that withdrawing of scholarships for PhD students is patently absurd. It's certainly going to affect the future of higher education. Well, I must say, as previous speakers have pointed out, it's not just the present government who have to hold many previous regimes also responsible for the sad state of affairs in our higher education system. But to a large extent, funding had not been affected too much in the old days. But that seems to be a new phenomenon, despite the, it's amazing, the finance minister says our economy is strong. Usual expression is our fundamentals are very good, whatever that means. And, and we also had this big bonanza, the oil prices crashing. Nevertheless, there's no money, especially no money for education. There is a proliferation of privately funded institutions of higher educations, but they are money-making machines. They enable unfortunately, many of our legislators are into it, and it's a money-making machine for them. That's about it. It has nothing to do with real education as such. Real education, of course, will promote rational thinking, which certainly the present dispensation is not favorably disposed to. The universities are the places where we are supposed to develop scientific temper, rational thinking, and some of our universities do produce, fortunately, people who can do that, who can think rationally. But unfortunately, the way these universities are being starved of funds, other higher institutions, laboratories, scientific laboratories and so on, starved of funds, it's not, they probably will not be able to deliver. The scientist especially is supposed to be ruled by reason. A mandatory suspension of disbelief is the credo of the scientist, as opposed to the willing suspension of disbelief, which is often quoted as the requirement for appreciating art. Well, the root of scientific temper is, as I would say, a suspension of disbelief. Sorry, suspension of belief. Sorry, suspension of belief. Well, the scientific temper is an idea which is promoted by Nehru. I am an unabashed admirer of Jawaharlal Nehru, and I guess most of the people present here are that. But unfortunately, he, at one period of time, in the early days of independence, he was essentially the darling of the middle classes. They were following him, but the middle classes have come a long, long way away from that. It's a great pity. We are a small minority, those of us who admire Nehru and his ideas, but unfortunately, that is the situation. And, well, we have to do something about getting the middle class back into idealism, the kind Nehru propagated. The promotion of scientific temper is no longer on the agenda of our governments, or even on the agenda of the so-called middle classes. The number of middle class people who are followers of godmen of different kinds is alarming these days. And that, of course, Professor Dabolkar and Professor Pansari and others, they have been working with people who are supposed to be relatively ignorant. But the middle classes seem to be getting more and more superstitious in many ways. And they seem to be doing it with a self-confidence which is very disturbing. You know, I do blame much of this on this so-called liberalization of the economy. I think what's happened is the old idealism has been replaced by an unabashed greed on the part of the middle class, ever since liberalism, so-called economic liberalism, came into force. Almost looks like "Gar se kaho, my no bhi hoon" seems to be the one. Take off from the. Well, that in such a context, we have to work a lot more, changing the mindset of the middle classes than even opposing the machinations of the government. I think in the long run, this is probably the solution to our problems. While attacking the government, certainly confronting the government is important, it's also important to see that the mindset for the middle classes changes considerably. The emancipation of our institutions of higher education has been a long run, it's an ongoing process. It's been there for the last decade and more, in many ways. But the present dispensation seems to do it with greater ability than any earlier ones. And they are backed, unfortunately, by an ideology, which is not the case with the earlier ones. The earlier dispensations were often hypocritical, but as I say, hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue. But the present ones are completely unconcerned about the situation. They in fact probably believe that they are going to restore to our higher education the glory of the Vedic days. And maybe they really believe it, I don't know, but it looks so. I probably sound very pessimistic, but I am, and there's no question about that. But it has been fought at every front. The pessimism is justified, but it's not a call to give up. Certainly not. One should fight it. I don't know how we'll go about it. Certainly this initiative here to talk about it and make propaganda against what's going on is very important. And I do hope this will succeed. And this movement will grow and succeed, especially in changing the mindset of our middle classes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Raghunathan.